the Stuarts, a bloody reign, is an evocation of the extraordinary era when these four Stuart kings lived through turbulent times. Catholic versus Protestant. Parliament against king. The English Civil War. Europe torn apart by religious conflict. The Plague. The Great Fire of London. And finally, a Catholic king fled his country and his throne.
As we reveal their fates, we'll trace the story of another family, the Wynns who lived here at Gwydir. They were there for the great events of the era, and their fortunes rose and fell with that of the Stuarts.
James I inherited a throne through his mother, Mary, Queen of Scots. This would bring the two kingdoms together, but at such a bloody cost.
I admire James I. I like his intellect and his inquiring mind. He was somebody who was very curious about life, a man who was trying to make sense of the world.
I think it's very important with James that he felt himself committed to promoting unity of his peoples, the peoples of England, Ireland and Scotland, unity of Europe, and the union of Christianity itself that might even reunite Protestants and Catholics.
Charles I, the reluctant king, pushed into being the heir because his brother, the magnificently suitable Prince Henry, had died. Charles struggled to be the king that everyone longed for.
Through history, we think Charles I lost his head, having lost a civil war. But we forget the years when he was seen as the luckiest monarch in Europe.
He was a highly sophisticated king. He really put British visual culture on the map, both in terms of what he commissioned in the form of Rubens and Van Dyck, but also what he collected.
Charles II, the restoration would bring unity and glamour back to the country. The people were worn out by the austerity of Cromwell and the parliamentarian era, and ecstatically welcomed the new king.
In the reign of Charles II, you have the birth of modern times. Clever people who were literally rebuilding England. And then the fire in London, which enabled London to be rebuilt. It must have been so exciting by the time you got to about 1700 to look around and find yourself in this spanking new city.
James II, the Catholic king of a Protestant country, was a disaster waiting to happen.
I think history is very tough on James II. He was a very brave, headstrong figure, a very good soldier, very good admiral. But unfortunately, being so pig-headedly Roman Catholic was the undoing of him.
In the autumn of 1605, a letter arrived here at Gwydir Castle for the owner, Sir John Wynn. It contained an urgent message. It implored Sir John not to travel to London for the opening of Parliament that November. Wynn had been planning to do just that. King James I, all his ministers, and the lords would be attending. John Wynn didn't know it at the time, but he just received a tip-off about the most notorious attempted terror attack in British history, the Gunpowder Plot. A small group of religious fanatics wanted to blurt Parliament, kill the king, and return Protestant England to the Catholic faith. The plot failed, but to this day, the 5th of November is celebrated across the country with bonfires and fireworks. But there was far more to King James I's rule than gunpowder, treason, and plot. James was the first of a new dynasty to rule England, the Stuarts, and he came to the throne at a dangerous time. Britain was divided as never before, between nations, between religions, between rulers and the ruled. Rebellion was in the air. Queen Elizabeth I had died on the 24th of March, 1603. She had ruled England for over 44 years, but she left no heir, so she would be the last of the Tudor monarchs. Succeeding her would be King James VI of Scotland, the son of a woman Elizabeth had put to death, Mary, Queen of Scots. However, despite this difficult family history, James I's succession to the English throne had been agreed by both parties via secret correspondence in the years before Elizabeth's death. James had held the Scottish throne since he was just 13 months old, but now he would sit on the thrones of England and Ireland as well, in what was known as the Union of the Crowns. We are here at the Charterhouse in Smithfield, London. This magnificent complex began life as a home to Carthusian monks in the 14th century, but its days as a monastery were brought to a violent end during the reign of Henry VIII. It became one of the great aristocratic houses during the Tudor period, and when King James VI of Scotland, soon to be King James I of England, headed down from Edinburgh to London in 1603, he held his first ever court right here. James had been invited to do so by Thomas Howard. Howard would be rewarded with the title of Lord Chamberlain in the new King's government.
Charterhouse is now a palace of the Howard family. Suffolk, resident there, is related to the man who had tried to depose Elizabeth in favour of James's mother, Mary, Queen of Scots. So the Howards are people he knows are loyal to him, and it seems to him that he's going to make him Lord Chamberlain, the head of his household, the man in charge of the everyday management of the court, that he's a crucial figure and he should be given priority when it comes to meetings in London and where he's seen to be.
James had been greeted by huge crowds of enthusiastic supporters as he made his way down from Scotland. But things turned sour almost as soon as he reached London and held his first court here at the Charterhouse. The original monastery built on this site was constructed on land that had been used to bury the countless dead from the Great Plague of the 14th century. Of course, the threat of another outbreak always remained, and it just so happened that the dreaded disease returned with a vengeance almost as soon as James arrived. It hampered his plans for coronation, and for many of his citizens, it was a bad omen about his reign.
Plague had been something they'd all lived with in these houses forever. I mean, they were well used to outbreaks of the plague, not just in London, but local outbreaks as well.
Those that don't like James think it's a judgment from God. Those who do like James think it's an unfortunate recurrence of the plague. There's apprehension because he's a foreigner, because the English on the whole don't like the Scots, and because they're worried about a Scottish takeover. And James has to balance that very carefully, because if he doesn't want to become a purely English king, neglecting his original kingdom to the north, but neither does he want the Scots to take over. And he does, initially particularly, a very good balancing act.
James knew he had to be especially careful of usurpers. His father, Lord Darnley, had been murdered, and his mother, Mary, Queen of Scots, had been executed. He'd faced attempts on his life while ruling in Scotland, and this didn't change in England. Almost immediately, two plots were being made to remove him from power. The main plot, the by-plot. Sir Walter Raleigh, one of Queen Elizabeth's favourites, was even involved in the conspiracy. But it was the Gunpowder Plot of 1605 that would come the closest to eliminating King James I.
The Wynns here at Gwydir are supporters of the new King James and are advancing in courtly life. John Wynn, head of the family, is about to return to Whitehall.
Attending Parliament would be injurious to my health. Richard, what meaning do you impute to that? Come on, boy.
He is your physician.
Ah, the city airs will be fettered, of course, and all manner of thieves and cutthroats will dog my journey, with plenty more to be found in Parliament besides. But ever before was it thus, and no letter then from my dear friend the doctor.
Some new peril lies behind this innovation. One that strikes at Parliament and even the King.
Aye.
Should we warn His Majesty?
There's always a problem with plots, as with the Gunpowder Plot, that in order to succeed, you have to have enough people to carry through the aftermath of the assassination of the king. But the more people you tell, the more likely it is you'll tell the wrong people and they'll leak it. And that's what seems to have happened here.
It is one of the great what-if moments in history. The 13 conspirators hired a cellar directly below the chamber in which James was due to appear. Under the supervision of their munitions expert, Guy Fawkes, they filled the cellar with dozens of barrels of gunpowder, more than enough to do the job. But too many people were being warned to stay away, and this aroused suspicions. One was the Catholic priest who warned his old friend John Wynne. Another was the writer of an anonymous letter which eventually made its way to the king and his Privy Council. And it would be Thomas Howard, the owner of the Charter House, and now the new Lord Chamberlain, who would head down to the cellars of Parliament in order to investigate. The entire cellars were searched, and Guy Fawkes and his barrels of gunpowder were discovered. After days of terrible torture, Fawkes confessed. The other conspirators were killed or captured. The plot had failed. The demise of the would-be terrorists triggered national rejoicing. But the plot exposed the divisions in James's new kingdom. How would he handle these challenges? And how would the Wynne family thrive in this dangerous new world? The Gunpowder Plot of 1605 had been foiled at the last moment. Parliament had been saved from destruction, and King James I continued to rule over Scotland, Ireland, and England. But this would be a challenging reign, to say the least. James had been raised a Protestant, and a Catholic conspiracy had been made against his life. To further worsen matters, not all of his new subjects were very pleased with the idea of a Scottish king, nor were the Scots thrilled by their monarch's departure for London. James sought to maintain peace amid these divisions. He did tighten anti-Catholic measures after the Gunpowder Plot, but otherwise, he broadly tolerated religious difference, provided it didn't threaten his rule. And there was another slight issue to deal with: a lack of money. A constant shortage of funds had plagued his time ruling in Edinburgh, and James hoped that his new kingdom would solve all his financial woes. This wouldn't quite be the case, given how extravagant a court James liked to maintain. So new money-making ventures were needed, and this need would benefit the Wynne family of North Wales.
Is this all of them?
It is.
I'm certain there were more.
The letters patent have been issued.
You do still have that list I sent you?
Owen, father is made baronet. His Majesty has bestowed upon us a great honour.
An honour we must pay for. £300 a year.
For 3 years.
Can purchase many books.
There exist some things more important than swelling your library, brother.
I cannot conceive of them.
The title will be the family's forever.
It will be our dear brother John's, and his sons after that. We younger brothers are better off investing in books.
It is a sign of royal favour.
It is a sign that the king has run out of money. Now, have you that list I sent you, or nay?
The Wynnes of Gwydir are perhaps the very first to get the baronet, which is a new hereditary knighthood at the James Institutes. You see, that's a very good way both of giving people a higher honour than just being an ordinary knight, and of course it's a money raiser because you pay for the privilege of being made a baronet.
Sir John Wynne was one of the first baronets, and the reason was that he was perceived to be the senior knight of Wales, really. There were two of Wales, one from the south, Sir Edward Stradling, and one from the north, Sir John Wynne. And I think it was self-evident when they put the lists together that his extraordinary dominance in all public affairs in North Wales meant that he was going to be on the list. He's very much of the period in that he's canny, acquisitive, he's very intelligent and very well educated, but he's carving out an empire for himself at a time when other people are doing similar. So there are a lot of heads being trodden on to get where he is, and that means there's a lot of jealousy, a lot of envy from his contemporaries, particularly his neighbours.
This was a win-win situation for the Wynns and the Stuarts. John gained greater power and status, and King James got money for the treasury by giving away titles to his most loyal subjects at an excellent price. King James needed to raise funds directly from the wealthier families in the country because he was often in conflict with Parliament, both in Scotland and England. He had been set on unifying his two nations. The kingdoms were on the same island, after all, and now they had the same ruler. James believed that God had made it so for a reason. The English and Scottish parliaments were fiercely opposed to the idea of Great Britain. However, the debates, they're about prejudice. Scots feared they'd be ignored by the English, while the English feared the Scots would undercut wages and steal jobs. Mutual animosity ensured the scheme never proceeded.
On the margins, there are people who really can't take James, they can't take a Scotsman, they can't take a Protestant. So there are a group of plotters who engage themselves with the idea of getting rid of him and replacing him by his cousin Arabella Stuart, who is also descended from Henry VIII's elder sister.
There was also the problem of competing visions. James believed in the divine right of kings. He illustrated his views in two of his published works, The True Law of Free Monarchy and Basilican Doron, which is Greek for royal gift. James believed he was chosen by God to rule, therefore the law was an extension of his power and Parliament was subordinate. Many in Parliament viewed the relationship differently. They believed a king ruled through partnership and cooperation with lawmakers. This fundamental disagreement doomed the relationship, and for much of his reign, James attempted to rule without Parliament, hence the need for extra sources of money.
I think one of the tragedies for the Stuarts, we look back on the executions, the exiles, and the general disastrous relationship with Parliament through a lot of the century or so that they were in control in this country. And one thing that is absolutely true is that they never had enough money. And Parliament wasn't prepared to give enough or to tax enough in their own way.
James brings in surcharges on customs, which are called impositions, which don't have parliamentary authority and therefore are controversial with some. And the result of that is the kings can manage on their own income in peacetime. The problem is, what will they do if they get into wars? Then you do need parliamentary supply. You can't possibly fund wars otherwise. And that's where the problems are going to arise.
James was struck by the greatest tragedy that could befall a man who believed in the divine right of kings, the death of his firstborn son and heir.
James has two children who survive infancy. Henry, who had all the hallmarks of being a great all-rounder, great sportsman, great promoter of the arts, but also someone who is clearly quite radical in his Protestantism and is strongly supportive of the Protestant cause internationally. Henry dies in a rather unwise exercise of athleticism by swimming in the Thames and getting typhoid from the water. Whereas his younger brother, Charles, who'd had rickets as a child, was bandy-legged, small, had a stutter, wasn't intellectually the match of his older brother. He lives on and is to be the heir, and I always suspect that when James and perhaps Anne looked at Charles, they always looked with regret. Why are you the survivor? Why has our golden boy died?
The country was devastated to learn about his sudden death, and a period of mourning ensued. His younger brother, Charles, who'd adored his elder brother and tried to emulate him, would now be the successor to James. Back at Gwydir Castle, Sir John Wynn would suffer a similar tragic loss.
Not long after the death of the heir to the throne, Prince Henry, devastating news arrives from Lucca in Italy about the passing of the Wyn's eldest son, John.
Dispatched from Tuscany by his companions. They had that decency at least. Dated this 23rd of August 1614. Bequests to the parish first, of course, as is proper. The family. To my brother Owen, £10 for the purchase of books. With temperance to your usual habits, that should see you through a week, perhaps.
Thank you, Father.
Thank your good brother. To Richard, my velvet coat.
Father, I need not.
Take it. Put it on.
It's interesting that, of course, James I loses his eldest son, Prince Henry, and Sir John Wynn loses his eldest son, Sir John Jr., so that they're both in the same sort of position in that sense, where the second sons have to take over. So it's interesting that Sir Richard takes over that courtly role and ends up serving Charles, who is himself the number 2.
The Wynn family and the Stuarts grew ever closer as Richard Wynn was appointed groom of the bedchamber to Charles, the new heir to the throne, and would join him on a wild and highly secretive voyage to Spain. But for now, both families were in deep mourning.
Richard,
I must make ready. I am required at court.
stay a day or two, for mother's sake.
I serve the young prince.
I hear he is a fine marksman now,
Tolerably so.
and a better rider than most.
He stammers yet and speaks too soft.
But his efforts, I am certain, gladden his father. Stay safe in London, brother. It becomes you well.
At this point, King James seemed beset on all sides, and he increasingly relied only upon his closest advisors. But this also led to huge resentments over the years, with the chief among them his infamous and controversial favourites. There's long been speculation over James's sexuality, because although the king was married to Anne of Denmark, he had 7 children by her. He was always drawn to handsome men, often with near disastrous consequences. The favourite of his childhood years in Scotland, the Duke of Lennox, had been forced out by jealous lords. Robert Carr, another who was close to James during the early years of his reign in England, until a court scandal engulfed him, a handsome, foolish youth, ended his career. James then transferred his affections to another young courtier, a man named George Villiers. He would use the king's favour to sideline rival factions, enrich his family, and become the most powerful nobleman in the country. The Wynn family weren't the only ones climbing up the social ladder during James's reign.
Villiers was obviously fantastically physically attractive. This is written about by ambassadors at the time. They were absolutely struck dumb by his physical beauty. And it was something that he was very aware of. And of course, you know, James I fell in love with him.
He was born into a decent but not massive gentry family, and then he puts him up to every stage. Baron, Viscount, Earl, Marquis, Duke. I mean, there hasn't been a non-royal duke for a couple of 100 years.
There's always the jealousy of the overmighty courtier, but in this one man, Buckingham, his rise through the aristocracy, the way that the favour from the royal crown cascaded through his wider family, it must have been incredibly difficult for the older aristocracy to look at this man, arrive from almost nothing, and become, by some distance, the most powerful man in the kingdom.
George Villiers would be raised to the title of Duke of Buckingham. He would be at the king's side for the rest of his reign, and he would play a crucial part in the events that would push England into war. We're here at the Queen's House in Greenwich, a magnificent building designed by the greatest architect of his era, Inigo Jones. It began construction in 1616 under the orders of King James I and was intended as a gift for his wife, Anne of Denmark, whom he'd married in 1589. But Anne would never see her finished Queen's House. She fell ill soon after construction began and died in 1619. Anne's a mysterious figure emblematic of the challenging religious era in which she reigned. She had been raised a Lutheran in Denmark, but it's possible that she may have secretly converted to Catholicism at some point in her life. She infamously refused an Anglican communion at her coronation in England. If Anne did convert, well, even a queen had to keep it a very tightly guarded secret. The lure of the old faith seems to have been present for the Wynne family at Gwydir Castle as well. But being a Catholic was a very dangerous endeavour.
Father. Will you not sit, Father?
I am not yet so infirm, eager though you may be for your inheritance, some wine.
Of course. The Prince still pins hope on the Spanish match. He has a portrait of the Infanta he much admires.
Enough of the Prince's fancy. What of the King?
He too remains set. I wrote of this in my letter.
You lack your brother's memorable expression. And the dowry?
600,000.
Utile dulci.
The pleasing and the useful.
Ah, the money spent on your schooling were not all wasted then.
We know very little about their personal beliefs religiously because this is such a dangerous time. You're not going to wear that. I think we have to read between the lines. I think it's pretty clear that his wife, Lady Sidney Wynne, she certainly came from an old faith family, the Gerards of Lancashire. I think it's pretty clear, reading between the lines, that she remained Catholic, but it was a secret. She was a crypto-Catholic.
She is to be allowed mass for herself and for her household, the Infanta. Should the contract be made?
She will not be queen. A papist alone England could suffer, but not a Spaniard too.
Many in court favour the match.
Until the tide shifts. And then marvel at how forgetful of his past a man can be.
Yes, Father.
Do not turn papist, Richard. That was your dear late brother's mistake. You keep that faction at a clear remove. Do you understand me?
I think one of the extraordinary things about the House of Stuart is that the whole tragedy of Catholic versus Protestant is contained within this royal house. It was never resolved, the question of whether England should become a Catholic or a Protestant country. You'd think, if you were a modern person, particularly if you weren't religious, but you just liked the idea of the Church of England and its inclusiveness and its beautiful music and its ceremonies, that this would have been the perfect compromise between the Protestant religion and the Catholic faith. In fact, it was even more divisive. And out of that arose the terrible, bloody English civil wars.
You can become a known Catholic, you can become a recusant, and it'll kill your estate. The fines are so horrendously large that you can bleed out the estate, and that'll be the end of that. So if on principle you want to do that, fine, and a lot of people did it. But most people actually just towed the line, and they went to church and they did their obeisance, and privately they might have thought otherwise. I think there was a lot of what one might flippantly call sort of cafetiere Catholicism going on, particularly with people like Sir John Wynne.
King James I was well aware of the delicate religious situation in the country. Many of his subjects in England and Scotland would be furious at any return to the Catholic religion in the royal family. But still, despite this, James attempted a union with Catholic Spain. By 1619, the king had lost his wife and his firstborn son and heir, and he would not get any respite in foreign affairs. War had broken out on the continent. The 30 Years' War started in 1618. What began as a quarrel among the divided states of the Holy Roman Empire drew in all the major powers of the day. And with 8 million casualties, it became the bloodiest religious conflict in European history. It was also the greatest foreign policy failure of King James I's reign.
I think for the British living across the sea from the 30 Years' War, it must have been a very frightening spectator sport, especially with the propaganda coming back from both sides. It resonated very much over here that this sort of absolute catastrophe could happen here through religious bigotry. I think it was something that the English looked at askance and thought, we just cannot have that here.
James was a peacemaker. He had ended the long Anglo-Spanish War soon after inheriting the throne, and he had grand hopes of securing a lasting peace in Europe. To do this, he began negotiations to marry his heir Charles to the Catholic Infanta of Spain, Maria Anna. The protracted talks were unpopular with the English Protestants. James, however, was more tolerant of religious differences than many, and he persisted. He believed binding England and Catholic Spain together would help secure peace in Europe. The 30 Years' War confounded all those hopes. It was a conflict the king could not ignore because he had a personal stake in it. His daughter, Elizabeth, she was married to the Protestant Frederick V of the Electoral Palatinate, a pivotal figure in the early years of the war.
England is requiring that the Spanish drive their cousins, the Austrians, out of the lands of James's daughter and her husband in the Palatinate, and that you're just asking too much. Rome is asking too much, in that Rome is expecting the children of the marriage to be brought up as Catholics, and James and Charles can't deliver that. So both sides were willing to make a deal, but only on their own terms, and the gap between them was simply too great.
After the catastrophic defeat of Elizabeth and Frederick's forces at the Battle of White Mountain outside Prague in November 1620, James had to intervene. But war was expensive, and money had long been a problem for the English crown. James recalled Parliament, but the meeting was fractious and the MPs were more interested in investigating abuses by James's government than giving him the cash he wanted. James soon dissolved the meeting, as he had done so often before. He now had no choice but to rely on his diplomatic efforts. The Spanish match for his son was the only chance he saw of diffusing the conflict and helping his daughter. Negotiation with Madrid began again, but at the same slow pace as before. Frustrated by these constant delays, James's favourite, the Duke of Buckingham, and his son, Prince Charles, made an extraordinary decision.
It is my ill fortune to be one of those who is shortly to follow the prince into Spain. Passed out, the journey will be dangerous and expensive, but as subject and servant I must needs obey.
Prince Charles and the Duke of Buckingham were heading to Spain incognito, and Sir John Wynne's son and heir, Richard, was going with them. In February 1623, this group left England in disguise for a potentially perilous journey across Europe. The goal was to break the deadlock in the marriage negotiations, with Charles winning the hand of the Spanish Infanta in person. It was romantic, foolishly daring, and it was doomed. In the spring of 1623, Richard Wynne, the heir to the Wynne estate, was travelling to Spain along with Prince Charles, the heir to the throne, and the Duke of Buckingham. Richard wrote back home to Gwydir that he did not care for Spain at all. Richard's letter is full of fascinating insights, but there's one I really wanted to read to you. The group encounters a Spanish Jesuit priest who is preaching to the crowd. The priest's description of England vividly illustrates the religious challenges of the era. Henry VIII, King of England, until whose time the subjects there were obedient children to their mother church of Rome, having many famous martyrs that suffered for the cause, as Sir Thomas Becket and Sir Thomas More, and diverse others. This king, I say, was the first who, to satisfy his own lust and to bring his adulterous conception to his own heart's desire, did, forgetting God and religion, alter the course of the ever-held obedience to the Church of Rome by dissolving their abbeys and putting to death I know not how many hundreds, for which act his soul lies chained in the bottomless pit of hell, in everlasting torments. This is not all their heretical opinions, but the damnablest and worst of all is, which is my last point, this is my body. They dare have the impudence to deny our Saviour's own words, saying it is but a sign and not the body and blood itself. Prince Charles wasn't likely to have much success on this Spanish sojourn.
The Spanish trip was an extraordinary fiasco, really, and marvellously amateurish and silly. It was like a sort of adolescent jape in some ways. To think that this would be anything other than a diplomatic disaster, which of course it was pretty naive. But off they went, Prince Charles and Duke of Buckingham, and of course Sir Richard Wynne. Sir Richard had a very low opinion of Spain. He said there's no land worth speaking of, and the worst counties of North Wales are better than what he saw in Castile and Aragon. I mean, he's quite dismissive of it. But they have all sorts of adventures, and of course, the one thing they don't come back with is any sensible deal on the Infanta's hand. They managed to sort of wreck the plans of this great dynastic union between England and Spain. But it's very interesting that Sir Richard is a witness to that, and not only a witness, but he produces this account of the royal trip to Spain. And very amusing it is.
The Spanish Infanta didn't really take to Charles, the future king. He wasn't a Catholic. He was an infidel who turned his back on the Church of Rome. This wasn't going to be as straightforward as his father James's marriage to the Lutheran princess, Anne of Denmark. When the disguised royal procession finally arrived in Madrid, their host presented them with impossible demands. The Duke of Buckingham got into terrible quarrels with the Spanish equivalent, and so Prince Charles had to negotiate for himself, hardly fitting for a future king.
The whole business of adopting disguises as travelling gentlemen and calling yourself Mr. Smith and all this sort of thing it's entirely silly. It's very adolescent. And, you know, going boating and dressing up and getting drunk. And, I mean, you can imagine how that went down with a strict protocol of the court of Madrid. I mean, ridiculous, really, to think that anything other than disaster would come out of that.
It soon became clear that the Spanish had been stringing Charles all along, just enough to keep England out of the 30 Years' War. Charles was virtually cast out after bursting in on the young Infanta in her own private garden. The men returned home humiliated.
The heat between those hills was such we thought ourselves in stoves. Yet at their heights we walked on snow, and colder it was than England in the midst of...
Lank as shot and herring. They feed you not over there?
At issue was not the quantity of fare, but its nature. Castile and Aragon together are not worth the meanest county in Wales. With Father's blessing, I shall see it published. Did he speak of my return at all?
He is as much relieved of your safe arrival as the nation is of the prince's, though perhaps with rather less dancing through the streets.
I cannot imagine Father ever danced a jig in his life.
No, not well, certainly. But come, tell me of it all. Tell me of Spain and the prince's great adventure.
You despair of the English court, brother. It is as nothing to the severity of the Spanish. The prince had convinced himself he was in love, but all chance of speaking with the Infanta was denied him.
The public, however, were delighted by their failure. Eager to court this and embittered by their time in Spain, Charles and Buckingham switched sides. They pushed the reluctant James towards war with Spain. Parliament was summoned once again. This time, its anti-Spanish fervour was equalled by many at court. Despite this combined pressure, James still refused to go to war. But his ability to control events was diminishing. James was dying. Courtiers looked to the future, to Prince Charles, who would soon be king. By his side in his endeavours was Sir Richard. who would be promoted to First Gentleman of the Bedchamber. The Wynns had lost their firstborn son and heir at the same time as the Stuarts, the royal family. They were about to lose their patriarch at the same time as well. Sir John Wynn was also succumbing to the ravages of old age.
27th of March, 1625. Dear Father, the King died this day at noon. He had been sick a fortnight with tertian fever. The stag that was dead yet lives. The young King was proclaimed this evening. He has promised he shall deal with me nobly, and I do believe a great office will be mine. I hope this letter finds you well and recovered of your recent sickness. Know that I endeavour each day to be worthy of your example. Your dear and loyal son, Richard.
In 1625, James dies. He's been ailing for quite a long time. He's been chronically unwell. Because of the way in which he sort of wastes away, and because of the way in which Buckingham is so hated by the political elite, of course, rumour spread very quickly that James had been poisoned. And in fact, Buckingham had, in defiance of the royal doctors, arranged for poultices to be applied to him, which it was easy for those that wanted to believe there was foul play, to believe there was foul play, and to a degree that historians have only recently begun to reevaluate the story that Buckingham had murdered James and that Charles had condoned it. Those haunted Charles right down to his own death 24 years later, and certainly were very prevalent in the months before the outbreak of civil war.
Historians debate James's legacy. To some, he's an intelligent, a flawed man who brought peace in a time of extremism. To others, he was stubborn, extravagant, and his belief in the divine right of kings sowed the seeds for his son's own clashes with Parliament and the bitter English Civil War that was to come. Charles I became King of England, Scotland and Ireland in 1625, succeeding his father King James, the second Stuart monarch. Like his father, Charles believed in the divine right of kings and shunned Parliament as irrelevant. As a result, he had a tempestuous reign and eventually led to the outbreak of a civil war. Sir Richard Wynn was a confidant of the new King Charles I, and he was appointed Groom of the Bedchamber and Gentleman of the Privy Chamber. Sir Richard Wynn and King Charles were long acquainted. Richard had even joined his future king on a pretty disastrous trip to Spain in 1623. Charles had hoped to negotiate his marriage to the Spanish Infanta Maria Anna, daughter of King Philip III, but he was forced to return home, humiliated. Charles's abject failure in Spain was an absolute delight to many back home. They did not want their future king marrying a Catholic. This was supposed to be a Protestant country now. However, Charles still ended up marrying a Catholic despite all of their protests. As he'd made his way to Spain on that fateful journey in 1623, he'd been to Paris, and there he met Henrietta Maria, daughter of the King of France, Henry IV. So that hopeless journey abroad, trying to get the Spanish Infanta, had not been in vain. Charles and Henrietta Maria would be married in Canterbury in 1625.
Henrietta Maria got married on the understanding with Pope Urban that she would try and do her best to bring England back to the true faith of Roman Catholicism, and also the sort of understanding that she would do her best to influence the royal family itself, the children that she would produce. The real problem was she was very zealously Catholic, so she flaunted her Catholicism, even to the extent that she refused to take part in the coronation because she would not have the proceedings overseen by a Protestant. It was something that was anathema to her.
It's very puzzling if you're a modern person to find the answer to why it should have been such a source of contention that Charles, the first ever monarch to be brought up as a member of the Church of England, shouldn't have been married to a Roman Catholic. She was French.
So you have really strong religious prejudices on the side of Queen Henrietta Maria and of a lot of people in political power in England. And it would have needed somebody to back down, and it wasn't going to be the politicians.
In the year of the coronation and marriage, 1625, Sir Richard Wynne is supposed to have planted out these 12 saplings that he brought back from Spain in 1623, which are the famous cedars here at Gwydir. There are 3 that survive. These are the earliest statement of royalism, which is going to be a feature throughout the 17th century of the relationship between the Wynnes and the House of Stuart.
This is the Queen's House in Greenwich. The building was designed by the great architect Inigo Jones, and it was intended as a gift from King James I to his wife, Anne of Denmark. However, she died during its construction, and the building was put on hold. Construction recommenced on the Queen's House when King Charles decided it would make a wonderful gift for his new wife, Henrietta Maria. A second level was even added by Inigo Jones, and Henrietta became one of Inigo's key benefactors. Just like her husband, Henrietta Maria was a devoted patron of the arts. Fortunately for the Queen, she had Sir Richard Wynne as a treasurer to help fund her artistic endeavours. Sir Richard would sign off her payments and often paid with funds from his own estate. Sir Richard Wynne was now a firmly established figure in the royal house of Stuart. Treasurer to the Queen Consort, groom of the bedchamber to the King. This meant he had the right to touch the King, a rare honour. Of course, this also meant he was preparing the new King for his many portraits. One of the King's very favourite artists was the exceedingly popular Anthony van Dyck.
Have you sat for many portraits yourself, Richard?
1 or 2, sire, though never for as skilled a man as Master Van Dyck.
The better sort to know faster. Let us try that one. There is majesty in art. If there be a lesson I took from Spain, it is that my court should outshine all others, just as England should outshine all nations.
Excepting Wales, sire.
Of course, excepting Wales.
It's difficult to understate the impact that this genius of portraiture had. He was like an impresario, crying action. And for the first time, people genuinely began to move in pictures. There was a feeling of illusion and realism in a way that Daniel Meutens had slightly prepared the English for, but Van Dyck swept the board with. I mean, one of the first things that he did, and Charles I, of course, was highly aware of the possibilities of an artist like Van Dyck. He collected the works of Titian. He was familiar and through osmosis of contact with the works of the High Renaissance. He knew that there were ways of portraying him and his court in a way that was different from the past.
No. No, it will not do. Take it away.
Forgive me, sire.
Did you fashion the collar, Richard?
No, sire.
Purchase it for my wardrobe?
No, sire.
Never make defense or apology before you be accused. Advice fit for statesmen, courtiers, and husbands. We shall try another.
Physically speaking, he was not prepossessing. He had a slightly gnomish face, very pronounced, slightly goggly eyes. He was also very small. He was 5'4". He had bow legs. He had rickets when he was young. And so he needed an artist to transform this rather unprepossessing human form into something magnificent. And I genuinely feel that when you look at those portraits of Charles I, Van Dyck has elevated him with a subtle manipulation of the brush into an almost Christ-like figure. Van Dyck brought with him this this box of tricks from the High Renaissance, and he dumped them down in London. And with all the tools, all the insights, all the technical brilliance and proficiency, all the sort of poetic mood that he was able to imbue his sitters with, he transformed the way we looked.
Despite a whirlwind start to his reign, Charles faced the same difficulties as his father, King James I. A strained relationship with Parliament and an urgent need to raise funds through unpopular taxes would force his reign into extreme tensions. With a 30 Years' War raging on the continent, it wouldn't be long before the country plunged into its own civil war and blood would flow.
Sir Richard Wynne, the owner of Gwydir Castle here in North Wales, inherited his property and his titles from his father, Sir John Wynne. Richard's brother Owen was a bookish type, interested in a variety of subjects, including the mysterious business of alchemy. Owen preferred to stay here at the family home of Gwydir, while Richard was busy in the court of the new king, Charles I. King Charles's reign had started at a frantic pace. He married Henrietta Maria, daughter of the King of France, just a couple of months after gaining the throne, and was already planning a war with Spain after those failed attempts to marry the Spanish Infanta. But Charles had inherited the same problems as his father: a poor relationship with Parliament and a misplaced trust in a particular figure at court, the Duke of Buckingham.
He'd been a favourite of King James and had retained a considerable amount of influence over King Charles as well.
There was a sort of intense friendship, which I think started on both sides from a mutual regard of how powerful the other one was. You know, Buckingham because of his royal favour, which he certainly didn't want to lose with a change of ruler, and Charles because he wanted to be loved by his father, and what better way of being loved than to show favour for his favourite. There was a sort of element of intelligence on both parts that diplomatically they should make the most of each other because it was going to further their own interest. But after James's death, Buckingham maintained this extraordinary hold over the throne for the remaining 3 years of Buckingham's life.
From the very beginning, Charles and Parliament don't get on. Distrust builds very, very quickly, not least because Charles is pouring money into failed military campaigns led by Buckingham, and Parliament doesn't see why it should continue to give money. He starts raising monies under his prerogative in ways which are truly controversial. It is one of the major issues which generates the distrust of Charles that is going to be in the background of factors for a civil war a few years later.
Despite a lack of finances, Charles pressed ahead with his intervention in the 30 Years' War, and an expedition was launched against Spain. Buckingham oversaw an alliance with the Dutch, and the plan was effectively to engage in piracy by raiding Spanish treasure ships returning from the New World with gold, and then to attack Spanish towns in order to drag the country out of the 30 Years' War. It was a complete disaster. Through bad luck and incompetence, at least 1,000 English soldiers died with nothing to show for it. People blamed the already unpopular Duke of Buckingham. The record Parliament mooted impeaching him, and Charles dismissed them, spare his friend. But he couldn't protect the Duke of Buckingham from all the threats. On the 23rd of August, 1628, Buckingham was stabbed to death in Portsmouth by a disgruntled army officer. Charles and the court mourned Buckingham deeply, but the rest of the country pretty much celebrated his death. The rift between king and country was growing deeper.
One of the officers, Felton, who had been on his first mission, stabbed him to death. And Buckingham knew the wound was fatal. He actually called it out. The shock in this country of the greatest non-royal in the country being just commonly assassinated was something absolutely astonishing. A lot of people didn't like the influence Buckingham had, but the thought of him suddenly being gone at the blade of an assassin was something that took a lot of coming to terms with.
Once Buckingham was dead, Sir Richard Wynne was one of King Charles's most trusted advisors. But he could also be viewed as one of the king's greatest benefactors. Richard's father, Sir John Wynne, had been offered a baronetcy by King James and bought it at a hefty price. Only Parliament could levy taxes, so Stuart monarchs had to find new, inventive ways of acquiring funds if they were going to ignore Parliament, as King Charles liked to do. He generated new income through the highly unpopular ship money levy. This was essentially a tax intended for wartime, but it was now levied during peacetime. It had only been imposed on counties that lay on the coast, but it was now implied inland as well. Families like the Wynnes would be the ones footing this massive tax bill.
Drawn up by Master Inigo Jones himself.
It's a bridge.
By the surveyor to his majesty.
I'm surprised the king can spare him. He must be a man much occupied.
A generosity typical of his character.
25 shillings and fourpence.
What?
25 shillings and fourpence. That's the king's demand, generosity, that arrived this morning courtesy of the sheriff. Ship money owed on our rectory.
Are we to dispute over 25 shillings?
That is but the latest demand, brother. We bear the Queen's debts, we pay the King's ship money. Were it not for the Irish estates,
The king must have means.
To gild his palace while our roofs fall in.
Whitehall is dilapidated. It shames the nation.
The nation has other concerns. I've seen the pamphlets.
The printing press may echo a voice 1,000 times over. It is still but one man. Do not be swayed by malefactors in London. The nation is happy.
I think one of the tragedies for the Stuarts is that they never had enough money. And Parliament wasn't prepared to give enough or to tax enough in their own way. Charles I was very keen to get round this problem and to use whatever device he could come up with. Anything that connected to the crown to raise money, he would look at. And ship money was the first really big disaster in terms of confrontation with people who were not prepared to put up with what they saw as an abuse of kingly power.
There is a case for it. There's a big European war going on. 20,000 English young people mainly are being captured by pirates coming from North Africa and taking them off to be slaves in North Africa.
Charles I, in fairness, was building up the navy in a very dramatic way, which was good for the nation. But to impose a tax on internal counties of England for the growing of the navy was a really difficult concept for people who are being asked to pay it.
He will not recall Parliament, then?
Why let that disputatious gathering disturb the peace?
I have conducted alchemic investigations these many years. Vapours, foul and copious, are a near constant. In the naivety of my youth, I sought once to contain those airs, lest farther catch upon the breeze a hint of my designs.
I remember.
I capped a fermenting bottle, yet my attempts at amelioration only worsened the explosion when it came.
Parliament is the bottle?
The country is the bottle. I fear the long containment of grievance without safe release will bring us all to greater misfortune.
The king may rule without Parliament so ever long he wishes.
It's not his prerogative, I doubt, brother, but his wisdom. It is a very fine bridge.
To do it without consulting Parliament and then to say, well, I have a right in a national emergency to raise these sorts of monies, when in fact there's time to call a Parliament, is to abuse your power.
It was just the first major step of Charles being seen as an absolutist monarch in an unacceptable, very un-British way.
The 30 Years' War had begun as a religious conflict between Catholic and Protestant states, and although King Charles had disengaged from the conflict, the religious divisions within his own kingdoms did not disappear. England, Wales, Ireland and Scotland all had their own unique and combustible mix of Catholics and Protestants. Many also suspected Charles of secret Catholic sympathies. His wife was French. His attempts to help Protestant allies in Europe were seen as half-hearted, and together with his Archbishop of Canterbury, William Laud, Charles passed a series of anti-Calvinist reforms.
These were particularly unpopular in Scotland. In 1639, the church and public there rebelled. Charles couldn't stand this affront to his authority, but he didn't have the funds to raise an adequate army. Scottish forces swept into England, seizing Northumberland and forcing the king to pay them for the privilege. Charles had no choice but to recall Parliament. Humiliated by the Scots and backed into a corner by his finances, Charles could not dismiss the members this time, and the men of Parliament quickly moved against Charles's government. Advisors were impeached, and new acts were passed, preventing the king from ruling alone in the way he had done.
The times seem as a man with ague. Some days good, some days bad.
I see not the good.
The remedy, as ever, is best found at home.
Executing Chief Minister Strafford has purchased not a moment's respite. Had His Majesty not called Parliament last year, I do believe the Earl of Warwick would have marched on London. Now, bit by bit, they gnaw away at his prerogative. An act for preventing the long intermission of parliaments, an act declaring ship money unlawful and void, an act for the regulation of the Privy Council. His Majesty is most sensible of the disrespect.
He will brook it, though.
He says it is but a few malcontents goading and leading the rabble on. I'm sure he has it right.
Come home, brother. If it turns to conflict, I would not have you here in London.
My place is with His Majesty.
Tensions were reaching boiling point in Ireland. Terrible killings took place between Catholics and Protestants.
Rumours abounded. Parliament wanted to impeach Charles's Catholic wife, Henrietta Maria, for collusion with the rebels. That, for the king, was the last straw. Charles marched on the House of Commons with an armed guard to arrest who he thought were his enemies, the opposition ringleaders. But the Speaker refused to surrender the MPs. Not long afterwards, Charles left London, which was increasingly hostile to him. Further negotiations with Parliament failed. Soon, both sides were raising armies. At Nottingham, on the 22nd of August, 1642, Charles raised the royal standard. The English Civil War had begun.
In order for there to be an English civil war, there has to be a collapse of authority in Ireland and Scotland first. You have to send an army to Ireland in order to safeguard the Protestants who've not been massacred. You can't trust the king with that army, but the king can't possibly be expected to, as king, to give over the power to control armies to a parliament that is a legislative body. It's not an executive body. So that becomes the non-negotiable issue in which all the tensions in England burst forth into violence.
I see the Civil War coming from a shifting of tectonic plates to do with politics, society and religion. There were very, very bloody things going on in the continent which show the intensity of religious feeling on both sides. There was a similar feeling over here about what is right religiously, and people believe passionately to the point of death in their particular brand of Christianity.
I think one of the things about Charles I, almost his besetting sin, was tactlessness. They were so in love with their idea of what the church was and how it could be beautified that they were stupidly intolerant of the Puritans.
Definitely, there was a class of people in the political sphere of England who believed that they should be representing the interests of the country versus the court. And equally vehemently, you have Charles I, and before him James I, believing absolutely rigidly in the divine right of kings. So there's a sort of religious conflict and a philosophical one about who's actually in charge of this country and what is it about.
Come.
Everything is ready, Your Majesty.
Do you know what they say of me, Richard? In these pamphlets?
I do not read them, sire.
They say I plot with Rome. that I conspire for the propagation of popery in my kingdoms.
They are seditious, sire.
They are bane, lewd, and wicked. But fire must with fire be matched. I have ordered a printing press be conveyed to Oxford with the court.
Very wise, sire.
Our own newsletter. Where they entice with empty falsehood, we shall nourish with the truth. So equipped, will the people shake off their current sickness and better affection be to their king. I shall return, Richard. And to such a welcome.
The stage was set for civil war. Charles on one side, Parliament on the other. Charles's belief in the divine right of kings was about to be severely tested. Charles set up his capital in Oxford. His strength lay in the north and west, whereas Parliament had the wealth in London and the southeast, and control of the navy. The initial battles of the Civil War were pretty much a draw, alongside intermittent and futile peace talks.
Father? Father? Is it from Uncle Richard? Father, what news of the war?
Oh, it's from one of our tenants. Oh. A clothier. He cannot pass army lines to reach market in Shrewsbury. Our drovers cannot take their cattle into England either.
Perhaps they should fight instead, if their lord would not forbid it.
Wisely, they keep themselves apart.
And no matter if people think them cowards, if people talk of them so.
Were I to hear such a word, I would correct it very seriously.
I think the Royalists were in the ascendant from the summer of 1642 until Marston Moor in 1644, marginally. I think the energy of the Royalists was quite impressive, but the fundamentals were against the Royalists the longer the war went on. The Navy being for Parliament and London being for Parliament, and then when the Scots came in, that was really the turning point.
He did believe in the divine right of kings. He believed he was placed there by God. It was his destiny as an anointed king to be the supreme head of the British state. Whereas the Puritans, fed with this Hebraic idea that there is only one king, namely Almighty God, disputed the idea that Charles Stuart, that man of blood, as they called him, should make any such claim.
I am a man grown.
We've spoken about this.
Is it not my duty to serve the king?
These people live in the mountains. They sow no crop. Their livelihood is in cloth, in cattle. Only by reaching market can they pay the rent. Only with their rent can we support the king. That is our duty.
It is yours. You cannot stop me.
But most of these drovers, these clothiers, are too old for the fight. They are perhaps fearful of losing what they hold dear. That does not mean that they have forgotten what it is to be young and eager.
I want to fight.
(1645) was a turning point in the civil war that had so far been a stalemate. Many in Parliament were unhappy that their advantage in resources hadn't translated into victory. They suspected some commanders of half-hearted leadership. They demanded change. So, in January 1645, the new model army was founded. It was to be professional, well-trained, a national army not limited to one geographical area like the old militia. And promotion was to be based on merit, not on social status. The new model army first took to the field in late spring 1645 under the command of Sir Thomas Fairfax and Oliver Cromwell. Its first major battle was on 14th of June at Naseby, where it faced the king's smaller but more experienced force. The result? A stunning victory for the new parliamentary force.
Naseby in Northamptonshire, that's the one which really settles it, because once the king's main marching army has been destroyed and his wonderful, wonderful infantry, there's no way to come back for him. The amount of territory he now occupies is too little to support the war effort. The emergence of the new model army, its first great victory at Naseby, is a clear sign that Parliament now has an instrument that will ensure that they will not lose the benefits of their great victory in the middle of Northamptonshire.
That Naseby defeat robbed Charles of his best men, his artillery, his stores, and his grip over the Royalist heartland of the West Country. Charles retreated to his capital, Oxford. Later, Charles headed for Conway Valley in North Wales, where he had loyal support. It's believed that he came here to Gwydir Castle upon the invitation of Sir Richard Wynne.
Sir Richard Wynne was at the side of King Charles as his brother Owen received this message at Gwydir.
He ever was an unfortunate king. Had the winds been otherwise in 28, a fine victory might have been his in France. Instead, he was garlanded with humiliation. Now, defeat hurries quick upon defeat. His last port is besieged and his forces spent, and word comes he would seek refuge here at Gwydir. To receive a king. That is an honour even I can recognise. Yet, danger slips through an open door. Offer your hand to a drowning man, you may be pulled down with him. Paint ourselves too lurid a royal hue, and we mark ourselves as the victor's prize. Oh. But will Gwydir at the last reject Caesar? Should peace be struck, his kingdom retained, he may remember the friends that betrayed him with more rancour than the enemies that fought him. Alchemic reaction once begun cannot so easily be undone. Yet, they will have an answer.
There was this king who was a charming man, had lots of good qualities, religious, thoughtful, very good family man, but a terrible king, and one who had taken very poor advice at a lot of key junctures. The problem with Charles was he was just so weak, and it used to drive Henrietta Maria mad. You see her letters to him from the safety of the continent saying, you agreed to do this, but you did that yet again. What are you doing? And he couldn't help himself. He just was easily swayable. And this was not a decade, the 1640s, where you could have a weak king and hope for a good outcome for the country or for him.
King Charles was running out of options. He was forced to surrender to the Scottish army on the 5th of May, 1646. And after months of negotiation, Charles was given up into the custody of the English Parliament, essentially taken to prison. Charles didn't give up hope. He knew about growing divisions between the Scots and the English, and between Parliament and the new model army. So he had a plan. He made a secret agreement with the Scots. They would invade England and, with the help of the remaining Royalist forces, return Charles to the throne. In return, Charles would establish a Scottish Presbyterian religion in England.
The king, having lost the war, tries to win the peace. I mean, he tries to play off his enemies against one another. Then it's not impossible that couldn't have worked. If he'd been a little bit more flexible in 1647, he could probably have made a deal with the army, and the army would have put him back on the throne. In return, what they were demanding was complete religious freedom, that there should be complete liberty. And that was better for him, I think, than having a Presbyterian, strict Scottish-style church government. He could have had a weak Episcopalian system, Church of England, the weak Church of England, but with complete freedom outside it, and he doesn't take that opportunity.
The Second Civil War flamed into life in 1648, but it was brief. The new model army put down the Royalist rebellions before defeating the Scottish forces at Preston in August. Charles was forced to negotiate. But those divisions between the new model army and Parliament had not gone away. Parliament voted narrowly to continue negotiating with the king. But by now, the army and Oliver Cromwell thought Charles a tyrant who had to be removed.
Choosing between the radical demands of the army and a king who surely is chastened and wiser than he was when we first fought him, faced by that, the army has a choice, and the army decides that God will not forgive them if they put man of blood, this man who had caused all this suffering for his people, if they put him back on the throne. So the army occupies London, it purges Parliament, it removes a majority of MPs, and it puts the king on trial.
When finally the king is taken, it's interesting that Sir Richard Wynne, of course, as well as his royal duties, was an MP. He then has to watch the slow unravelling of the Royalist cause. And he'd been in his service for all these years, already when he was prince, and going all the way through, having carried his robes at the coronation, having been with him on a drunken jaunt in Spain, having done all those things with the king and then ultimately with the Queen later. It must have been terrifyingly difficult for anyone to cope with.
There was a strong element of Parliament who were not in favour of the king being tried on any level. It was a huge jump for people mentally to go from the king that they had always been taught as being a representative of God and a figure of great awe, even though he had been defeated in battle repeatedly, and even though he was reneging on agreements, he was still the king. And to a lot of loyalist members of Parliament, they could understand a way forward where the king might be persuaded to be a more acceptable form of himself.
The trial of a king was something new in England. No existing court thought the trial legal, so Parliament had to create a special body to try Charles, and it met for the first time in Westminster Hall on the 20th of January, 1649. Charles was accused of high treason, held responsible for all the death and destruction caused by the war. Of course, Charles didn't recognise the court's authority. He refused to enter a plea, insisting the trial was not only illegal by English law, but against God as well.
The colonels of the New Model Army were the dominant force, really, in the trial of Charles I. They'd seen too much bloodshed, and they could then only see Charles as this famous phrase, this man of blood. He was no longer Charles, King of England, on a pedestal. He was just another man who had caused this appalling bloodshed. And I think it's always worth remembering that the English civil wars, they caused the heaviest loss of life percentage of population in this country ever, including the First World War. And the casualties were even worse in Scotland and considerably worse in Ireland. So I think that with all that in mind, people thought, those who hated the king by this stage, or who certainly loathed the bloodshed that went with the king's cause, I think they thought that if we can just lop the head off, literally, the crown, then we could have a fresh start and no more blood.
The court sentenced Charles to death. He bade farewell to his children who were with him to the end. He requested 2 shirts so that he would not shiver from the cold and so give the impression of being afraid.
The king was beheaded on a scaffold outside Banqueting House in Whitehall on the 30th of January, 1649.
You look tired.
Were you there? When they...
Richard.
May we all meet our deaths in so steadfast a spirit.
Did they grant him any last words?
The soldiers kept us at a far remove. A scaffold had been erected. It was at the banqueting house, designed by Master Jones.
Like our bridge.
I could not hear what he said. I saw him speak a prayer, then kneel at the block, hands outstretched before him. When the axe fell, the crowd gave out a moan as I never heard before, and desire I may never do so again.
Charles, king and martyr.
Charles.
It's interesting that Sir Richard Wynne just sort of fizzles out, and a few months after the execution of the king, he's dead. He's dead himself. In the 19th century, they would have romantically said he died of a broken heart, but he really had no purpose. He sort of fizzled out. It's a sort of unspecific illness. I think he just wasted away, probably through grief.
The House of Lords was abolished and executive power wielded by Parliament and its Council of State. The new model army was the most powerful force in Britain. With Oliver Cromwell in command, it swept aside all remaining military opposition. In 1653, Cromwell disbanded Parliament. He thought it quarrelsome and ineffective, and seized power as Lord Protector. In the end, the bloody English civil war between King and Parliament saw both sides lose. All the while, across the sea, Charles's son and heir waited in exile.
In the next episode of The Stuarts, A Bloody Reign, the heir to the throne, Charles II, goes into hiding on the continent, where he is stunned by the news that his father has been put to death. For over a decade, Charles travels in exile around the royal houses of Europe, planning to overthrow Cromwell's Commonwealth and restore the House of Stuart. But his attempts are in vain, and it seemed all hopes are lost. However, the tides begin to turn back in the Stuarts' favour with the death of Cromwell, and soon Charles II will be welcomed with open arms by an adoring public in London. The restoration of the monarchy sees a return to prominence for the Wynne family as well. But there are many enormous obstacles to overcome, including a huge outbreak of the dreaded plague and the Great Fire of London.